My name's Jessica Bonnier, and on behalf of the Explore Spirituality Committee, it's my pleasure to welcome everybody to the talk this afternoon and to welcome Tekla Hendrickson from MaidHouse Toronto. We're very pleased to have you here, Tekla. Thank you. Just a bit of background, Tekla is the executive director of MaidHouse, and she has extensive experience locally in the GTA and internationally in managing not-for-profits in areas of health promotion, homelessness, and women's health. So please join me in welcoming Tekla Hendrickson. We're delighted to have you at Fairlawn today.
Thank you very much for joining me and engaging in this conversation. So I always find it very helpful to kind of make sure we're in the room and having the same conversation. So why I'm here and hopefully why you're here is it's really important to talk about end-of-life issues and how to enhance our end-of-life experience. So that could be at hospice MAiD, but just generally having conversations about death and dying and end-of-life is super important. I would like to give you an overview of MaidHouse, what we do, what we are as an organization, and then I want to talk about the importance and the impact of that work. So hopefully that's why a majority of you are here as well. The other thing I want to acknowledge is that as we're talking about death and dying, as we're talking about grief and MAiD, I suspect that most of you bring your own lived experience and personal experience into the room. So everyone, if something comes up for you or a memory, just remember to breathe into that and, let that be. So people, and it's also very personal. So, but my perspective on this won't necessarily be your perspective on this, and that's okay. What is important is that we have a conversation about that, hear each other, and then have that inform our perspective. So my intent is not to have you think or believe what I believe necessarily, but to share my experience so that you can then reflect on that as well. Does that make sense for people? Is that comfortable? Okay, so by the end of the conversation, what I am hoping you will is have a general overview of medical assistant in dying, MAiD, because I think it's important we all share a baseline understanding. As I said, an understanding of MaidHouse, an issue around, talk about issues around access to medical assistant in dying broadly, but also around space. The impact of safe and inclusive space from a physical and emotional perspective. So we're going to talk about space both as a facility, but also as a place to hold you, a place to be with your emotions, and then hopefully an opportunity for questions. Does that work for everyone? Perfect. So again, like I said, I want to go into an overview. It's just a very high level overview, and I'm not an expert on all the legislation, but just so that we're sharing a common understanding. Is in June 2016, Parliament passed federal legislation that allows eligible adults to request medical assistance in dying. Medical assistance in dying is when a physician, an MD, or a nurse practitioner prescribes or administers medication that causes death. The procedure for most MAiD deaths in Canada is through a series of intravenous medications, in contrast to those in the US where they use only oral medications. As I was talking to Alan early, you do have an opportunity to access oral medication through Canada and self-administer, but very few people use that. Some important things to recognize around MAiD is Dying with Dignity Canada, as well as other polls, show that the majority of Canadians support and recognize the constitutional right that for patients to access MAiD, medical assistant in dying, as long as stringent qualifying criteria are met. So there was actually just a different poll from a different organization trying to highlight different issues, but they did share the same perspective that most Canadians actually agree with medical assistance in dying. So while you read in the press and you hear a lot of pushback, that is not necessarily reflective of Canadians across age, socio-demographic, racial status, disability. The majority of Canadians, when you dig down on the stats, do support medical assistance in dying. The other thing to remember is medical assistance in dying didn't come from politicians. Medical assistance in dying came from people in the community, like Sue Rodriguez and other disability advocates and other advocates who went to the courts and fought long and hard for that right over years. So it was a long conversation, an important conversation, a conversation we continually have to look at and reflect that we have our legislation right. And it was legislated by the court. So MAiD is actually one of the few aspects of medication and of medicine where a doctor could actually be taken to court, found guilty because they're offside the law. So if you're dealing with cancer, there isn't necessarily laws governing that, whereas MAiD, there's strict laws around that. The other thing that's really important to recognize around MAiD is that it is only the person who is requesting MAiD. So only I can request MAiD and see if I'm eligible through 2 assessments. My partner can't, my children can't, someone who wants my money can't. No one else can request MAiD on my behalf. There is no standing proxy, there's no, if you have power of attorney, only the person having MAiD can consent to that. And there is a consent process to request it. But even in my work on the day of death, which I'm there bearing witness to, people are asked if this is what they want. So you have to give consent, and you can withdraw that consent at any time. And that also does happen. Just because you're approved doesn't mean you have to go through with it. So some people get approved for MAiD, they get relief from that approval, and then they never choose a date. So there is no obligation to be approved and immediately pick your day of death. So in Canada, just to put it in perspective, from 2016 to 2022, there were 44,958 deaths through medical assisted in dying. So that is 3.5% of deaths in Canada were through MAiD. There has, again, probably in the media you've seen some concern about the percentage of deaths through MAiD and that it's going too fast or too many people. People have different perspectives of why that's happening. Some believe because since 2016, there's been education and awareness, so people actually know medical assistant is dying is an option. So for example, when I was supporting my dad through his death, and I mentioned MAiD and just was exploring that with him, he didn't even know that that was legal. Flash forward to now, there's a lot more awareness that this is a right and an opportunity. As well, the number of people who are eligible and the people who are willing to provide MAiD has increased. And the last kind of overview that, to set the context is where does MAiD most commonly take place? So when I say medical assistant in dying, where do you think it most often takes place? Home. I heard hospital. Anyone else? Palliative care. So MAiD actually can take place anywhere that you and your provider are comfortable in it happening. So in 2022, 39.5% of MAiD provisions happened in home, and 30.5% was in hospital or a hospice, 20.8% was long-term care, and as I said, you can pick any place that is meaningful to the individual. It is important to notice that a small number of care settings do not permit MAiD activities to take place on site. So if you end up in a Unity Health hospital, they would help you navigate the assessment, but you couldn't actually have your MAiD profession at St. Mike's, for example. And there are also some hospice that don't allow it on site. So any quick questions or comments about that till we move on to the next part?
Is it St. Mike's because of the Catholic
Yes.
orientation?
So the Catholic hospitals, St. Joe's, St. Mike's, do not allow MAiD on site.
What's the age limit downwards?
18, adult.
If you have the pills, and you want to take them yourself, can you do that?
You have to still go through the assessment process, so you still would have to have 2 medical professionals, a nurse practitioner or a doctor, find you eligible, and then you can access those medications. And I believe in Ontario that they also still ask that a MAiD provider is bearing witness while you do that. Yep.
Can you prearrange a medically assisted death in the case of Alzheimer's, so you know that Alzheimer's is you're in the early stages? Can you say, when I don't remember my family or whatever, I want to have this done.
So in Quebec is the only province you can do an advance request that is known as an advance request. And they just made that legal last month at the end of the month. So it hasn't happened elsewhere in Canada. That is not legal. But if you have Alzheimer's, you're not precluded from medical assistance in death if the MAiD providers find you eligible, but you still have to be able to give consent. So there is this concept of 2 minutes before midnight where you might meet certain criteria. So there are people who with Alzheimer's and other criteria might still have MAiD, but they are still able to give consent. So we do not have that advance request like they do in Quebec.
So you have to be alert enough on the day of the death to say I consent.
Yeah, there is one difference in that. I'm not going to go into big detail, but there's a track 1 and track 2. Track 1 is when your death is reasonably foreseeable. So you're going to die very soon. And let's say you have a very aggressive cancer, as for an example. If you have that, your track 1 approved, you have set a day of death, you can sign a waiver of consent with your MAiD provider, which says that if on this day I can't give consent, then you can use this waiver of consent. But you have to have been approved, you have to be track 1, and you have to have met some other criteria that you work with your MAiD providers. But that's not the same as an advance request where you state you want MAiD under certain conditions, but you haven't actually met those criteria yet.
Is that going to change?
We don't know. The government's consulting on that now. And if people want more information, the best source of information is Dying with Dignity Canada, who is running many campaigns around that. Specific to Alzheimer's, the Alzheimer's Society of Canada has statements about advance requests in Alzheimer's and resources as well.
After the application and the interviews have taken place, and perhaps consent has been given, where is that consent kept? And can relatives call in and ask for that?
No one is health information, so no one else can. Pardon? Sorry. So if you've been approved and your consent that you want MAiD, where is that kept? And can relatives phone in for that? So your consent is kept with your MAiD provider, your documentation is kept with your MAiD provider. No one has access to these conversations. No one else has the right to know that you are going for MAiD or choosing to MAiD unless you choose. It is solely that person who is requesting MAiD to decide who they involve and how they engage. And as I said, the consent process, there's many moments of having to give consent. So, throughout. So when you read that it's very easy to get MAiD, then people have not gone through the process. It is not. It can be done fast, but it's not easy. And as I'm sure you would imagine, if you yourself are facing death and you are making these decisions, it's not an easy decision to make. So back to the stats, just if anyone likes to dig down a little bit further, Health Canada puts out an annual MAiD report. So if people go on Health Canada MAiD annual report, they would be able to find how many MAiDs, where, the demographics, who access them. So if people are interested in more information. So what motivated MaidHouse? Why is there a MaidHouse? I'm just going to read you a quote from Mark Somerville. When Mom started thinking about undergoing the MAiD procedure, one of the challenges for her was where would she be most comfortable. She couldn't stand the house where she was living. It was dilapidated, moldy, and would not be comfortable for this extremely powerful moment. Also, she had always disliked hospitals and their sterile and clinical surroundings. MaidHouse would have fit her needs perfectly, somewhere supportive that felt like home, a comfortable and safe feeling space to take her last breaths in this life. So there was a group of co-founders who were people who had supported people through MAiD, who were early adopter MAiD providers, bioethicists, who realized that people might need a place and space to have MAiD. So why people would need a space, what would motivate them? When we heard earlier that people could have it at home, it's also why people, where they choose to have MAiD, is they're concerned about their loved ones, their association of their home with loss, with death. They're concerned that maybe they don't want it happen at home, that if they're at MaidHouse, that there's people like me who are there to be as present or not present, because we are more disassociated from the experience of death. So having someone that slightly professionalizes it or is just there for support as a community base is something people are looking for their loved one. As I talked to you about earlier, living in faith-based institution, hospice, or shelters where MAiD is not permitted. So about a fifth of the people who come to MaidHouse are coming from a faith-based institution. We call them forced transfer. They're not my favorite. I think they're slightly cruel, and people are bumped along and the families are disoriented. But once they get them, we can wrap them and provide them with good service. But to get to us is not necessarily a pleasant journey. There are a few people who are in crowded or insecure housing. The co-founders thought that that would be more of the people who used a MaidHouse, but we found very early, if you look at the stats, people who access MAiD tend to be older, well off, well educated. So that is the higher percent. The people who access MaidHouse reflect those demographics. There is time when family members are not supportive of the MAiD decision. They don't want their person to have MAiD. They don't want it in the house for a variety of reasons. So then MaidHouse becomes an option, because as we talked about it, it is only that person's individual right to choose once they're eligible whether they have MAiD or not, and no one else has standing in that decision. And that's actually being decided by the court of law as well. And then overall, there's discomfort with death and loss. So I talked about that a little bit, people wanting to come where, there's people to help kind of orient them what's going to happen, what to expect, and help organize a lot of the logistics that are associated with death. So Dr. Sandy Buckman, who is a palliative care doctor as well as a co-founder of MaidHouse, talks about his motivation for bringing people together to establish MaidHouse. For anyone who requests and is eligible to receive MAiD and whose own home environment is not suitable or an option in which to receive MAiD, they do not have the same equitable choice. Not all hospitals, palliative care units, residential hospices permit MAiD, nor do many retirement homes or shelters. For the same reason where a person's residence may not be the optimal environment to experience dying and death, they may not be optimal to experience MAiD. A large metropolis like Toronto needs an independent facility like MaidHouse. It provides that compassionate choice. I will say that when MAiD became legal in 2016 to now in 2024, that some of the institutional organizations who were not as comfortable with MAiD or did not allow MAiD have actually changed their policy, that people have more experience, feel more confident in the safeguards, see the compassionate care that it can be, and therefore have opened their doors so that there is less people who are not allowing in their space. So they developed MaidHouse. So what is our goal? Our goal is to create a safe, supportive, inclusive place where everyone eligible has equal access to a free space to have MAiD with their chosen provider. So I think it's really important to note that MaidHouse, my goal is not to increase the number of people who have MAiD. Our goal is to make sure people are having end-of-life discussions, doing advanced care planning, know what their options are, whether it's hospice, home, or whatever that is, know how to navigate the system to get their choice, and then have no barriers, like, for example, not having a space to have MAiD. How many people have MAiD? It's not my interest at all, but that whether they choose that, they are able to move forward with that if they're eligible. Our mission is to increase access to community-based space for MAiD with a commitment to enhancing the end-of-life experience for eligible individuals and their support networks. So we are a community-based organization and all that entails. And as I am sure you do in the church, we value comfort, community, dignity, and excellence. So we were incorporated in 2018 as an independent nonprofit charitable organization. We are the first in North America, and we believe globally, and we're national in scope, and we've started with our site now 4 years in operation in Toronto. We are funded by individuals, foundations, and donations, as well as grants. We get no government funding at this time. And we have 3 key programming areas: access to space, grief and bereavement resources and supports, and a Center for Excellence for Education, Research, and Training. So if you are interested in learning more about people who have used MaidHouse, we do have that bit of challenge that the people that we serve are no longer around to tell their story. So we have on our website what's called MAiD Journeys, and people who have chosen to have done some oral interviews or shared interviews with us, and those are posted on the website. What we found most interesting about this process over the 4 years is obviously when we started it, we actually wanted people to talk about why they're choosing MaidHouse and why we're so great. And what we really found is people were very uninterested in talking about their decision for MAiD. They wanted to talk about their life. Their death was their life. Their reflection was their life. Their death was an extension, as Jessica talked about, how they lived their life. So many people wanted control. They had choice. That they were having MAiD or that it was MaidHouse was incidental, was the least important thing they wanted to share with us. So we let go of those questions and we just capture the stories that people want to share, and they are quite interesting, the lives that people have lived and how at peace they are with the decision that they have made. The other thing that's important when we're talking about MaidHouse or MAiD is about language. So when you're talking about MAiD, it is not suicide, for example. There is that language of choice and autonomy. And as Jessica shared for her dad and many people I've seen, they really are about choice and autonomy. MaidHouse is on a second floor of a building. We have accessible requirements, chairlifts and elevators. But some people I asked, do you want the chairlift? And they say, no, I'm going to take the stair. And you see this determination, my will, my choice, and I am making it up those stairs. I never thought the stairs and walking upstairs would give me so many moments of profound moments where you see the will and determination of people and all that they're processing. Also regarding grief and bereavement, and again, how we talk about that and what that means and what we say. I certainly have had some people transferred and it caused them pain, it causes me pain, where a nurse, for example, has come up to them and has found out they were having MAiD and said, you're going to go to hell. Can you imagine to be on death, making your decision, transferring with your loved ones, and someone feels that they have the right to make that decision after all this legislative safeguards and everything, regardless of your belief, like where's the compassion and stuff. And I saw that impact on that person as they came to MaidHouse and what that meant and what that family had to live with after. So to access our space at MaidHouse, you have to be approved for MAiD. So we're not working with people before they are approved. You have to have a MAiD provider who is asked to be on MaidHouse list. You actually have to identify a next of kin or executor, because after you die, it's your next or kin or executor who decides what happens with your body and if your body can be moved. So we need that to deal with the process after death. You have to identify a funeral home, and we have no geographical criteria. There is no charge, as I mentioned earlier, and nothing else as a barrier to our space. When we started MaidHouse, the first provision I did and what I was directed by the board was we were really looking as a physical space. We provide the place and space where people come on their day of death for MAiD provision. After I did my first one, I had some very unique moments of learning to say, okay, first of all, spaces, as I mentioned at the beginning of the conversation, is not just a physical space, but it's about a place where we embrace and wrap around and hold people. We are with people and those they have chosen to be with them at one of their most intimate moments, who are going through many different experiences and feelings. How does that space encompass them, welcome them, hold them in those moments? It doesn't mean we're overly present, but even how we set up the space, that the space looks warm and doesn't look like an institution, that those who accompany them can bring flowers or pictures and really personalize and enhance the space. The other thing that really became important, as I talked about, is MAiD is about the person having MAiD and the individual who chose and that they're eligible and they're MAiD providers. And everyone who works in MAiD really focuses on that. As people came, the first person who came had 14 other people with them. They didn't know what was happening. They'd never experienced it before. And I'm like, wow, if I'm going to do a good job and enhance this experience, People better know what's going to happen and what to expect, because it's going to impact their grief after. And we need shared information so that, as Jessica talked about, people have time to plan. What do they want? How are they going to do that? So we hold that balance of always focusing on the person having MAiD, but making sure we support those who are accompanying them. It can be up to one person, it can be 20 people, it can be 3 dogs, and we've had children, and that requires different things. So how do we do that work, and what does that look like? We are located in the Toronto West End, and we can be used for provisions and assessments. So as I talked about, you can really personalize the space and experience. And it is one of those things that you hope that people aren't keeping up with the Joneses. Some people really want a celebration in life. They invite a lot of people. Other people want just a small, intimate group. Some people see it as an opportunity. I've had people have champagne and music and crafting, and they spend 5 hours in the space. Some people are very matter of fact. It's a medical appointment. I want to be in and out. For their experience, they'd like to be there 10 minutes at most and have everything over. What we have found is for those that are accompanying them, you feel like you've been hit by a truck. So we ask that everyone come at least 45 minutes before. That actually isn't necessarily for the benefit of the person having MAiD, it's for those that are supporting them, so that they have time to figure out what's going on and where things are, learn, because some of them haven't heard about what's going to happen. You carry those stories forward. So we want to make sure we give a foundation for that. And the other thing we do is we provide clear logistics and a way of working that provides support around the grief and bereavement. So when people think about grief and bereavement, they often talk about, we're in a group, we're sharing, we're talking. That's actually not our focus. We did some research funded by CAMAP, which is an organization that supports MAiD providers. And what we found is what I've been talking about is people don't know what to expect, or the organization and the logistics. So we try to make on the day of that people have had time to think about what that looks like, so that afterwards they feel good about their person they supported and said, I helped them with their choice. We were able to meet what they wanted. We thought about all these things and we gave them that. The other thing is to know what to expect. MAiD and death is a bodily function, so people want to know that there's not incontinence, there's not pain, your mouth might drop open at the end. If you're not expecting those things, it can be quite alarming. People can snore after the first medication. So having people have an understanding of what's to come and how much time is super important for people to be able to stay present. The other thing we do is help with the transfers to funeral home, because as you can imagine, if someone's died, you're immediately on the phone to the funeral home. That's like pulling you out of that experience. So we're able to take care of that logistic with consent so that people can actually be in the moment in their grief. What I can't take away is I can't take away people's sadness. People are sad when they are at MaidHouse, and there are many other feelings as well: grief, relief, wondering if they killed their loved one because they helped plan it, and it's a little bit of a mind game. So giving them support and validating those feelings. We also provide resources. We do have a quilt project, so if you do or have supported someone through MAiD, we are making little house pieces and joining them together. That's another way we are supporting in memory and people dealing with grief. In terms of education, we have a bi-monthly newsletter. If you're interested in joining our community, we hold virtual events. Just last week, we did one for National Grief Day, and it was with a graphic memoir of someone. It was called Something Not Nothing, and the author came and talked about her experience with her partner having MAiD and her grief after. We do an annual event of Art for the Soul, because what we have found in doing this work is people use a lot of music, a lot of art. They get comfort from that, both in enhancing their end of experience and dealing with their grief after. So we think art is a very powerful tool around the concepts of death and dying. We are expanding our program areas. We do have some volunteers who work with us who are there on the day of the MAiD provision. We are opening a site in MaidHouse in Victoria in 2025. Other resources that you might be interested in knowing who do work in this is there's Bridge C14, who helps people navigate requests for MAiD, as well as grief and bereavement supports. There's CAMAP, which provides education around MAiD. It's particularly focused on MAiD providers and assessors. There's the Canadian Virtual Hospice, which provides information about death and dying in general. They have a website called mygrief.ca, but they also have MAiD specific videos and information that is very, very well written. Dying with Dignity Canada does the advocacy around the legislation. So for those people interested in advance request or advance planning, they are a good organization. MAiD Family Support Society is a peer group. So for someone like Jessica, who is a daughter who has supported her dad, she would be paired with another daughter who supported their dad. So it's peer support at any time during the process. Wellspring is a cancer organization, but as you can imagine, many people with cancer have chosen MAiD, and they have done MAiD-specific grief groups that are available virtually. So Wellspring is another organization that does support that I think is important that people know about. So that is MaidHouse, and I am open to questions. And again, I hope you do subscribe to our newsletter and look on our website for the MAiD journeys, but that's kind of a glimpse of the work that we do. So questions, comments, concerns?
I related once at Barasha. Would you give us the website, and would you tell us where you're located, how you're funded, how many staff you have, in other words, how it works?
So we're at www.MaidHouse.ca. There's that. How many staff you have? We've just expanded. So it was me, myself, and I, except for 2 months ago, where we've hired a program person for MaidHouse Toronto. We also have a part-time fundraiser and a part-time communication person for our processes. We are in Dundas, West Runnymede, the Junction area, but we have people come from Niagara Falls, Collingwood, Milton. So we have no geographical catchment area. If you can make your way to us, you can come to us. And did you have another question? Did I get them all? Yeah, okay. And our funding is just private donations and foundations. We get no government funding at this time. No, we're working on it.
Thank you for your very comprehensive presentation. I don't know if you can comment on this. The recent change in legislation in Quebec, do you know if there were any specific advocacy groups like Dying with Dignity, any other organizations that helped kind of propel that legislation along?
I believe that there's a Quebec group that works specifically in Quebec, and then the MAiD providers and the community there really push for it. I don't know a lot more about that and the background of that. I know for the rest of Canada who's taking that voice is Dying with Dignity Canada. And then the only other thing I know is, so Quebec is actually outside the law. They are going against the legislation. The federal government has chosen not to take them to court, and they are consulting with Canadians across Canada. So if you looked at Advance Request Health Canada, you would find the information about the consultation process, or Dying with Dignity Canada would provide that information.
Do many people request MAiD at home? Is it offered at home?
Yes, so about 32% of people choose MAiD at home. Yeah.
I don't know if this is appropriate for you to answer now, but a relative of mine told me that he asked for this process to happen, and that 3 doctors came in and interviewed him, and then 3 different doctors came in later. And so I'm just curious, you know, what kind of questions or what are the criteria that a person has to meet in order to be approved?
So that goes more outside my scope of work because we don't do the assessments or eligibility. What I can tell you is there is a track 1 or track 2. It sounds like your relative would be a track 2 when your death is not reasonably foreseeable. So that means you would have 2 doctors or nurse practitioners who go through an assessment process to see if you meet the eligibility criteria and the safeguards. And then they have to wait 90 days where they consult any of your expertise on the topic topic or their health condition they have to see if you are eligible. So that sounds like they are in that process. But the only people who can tell you if you are eligible is a physician who is an assessor or a nurse practitioner. There is no one else who can deem you eligible for MAiD and whether you meet those requirements. So even though I've done lots of experience and I've supported people on their day of death and know quite a bit about it, I would not be able to assess or make that determination.
So what you just said, is every doctor an assessor, or, and how does one become an assessor?
So there's no training. CAMAP does have training for doctors and nurse practitioners who are interested in learning more about MAiD assessment and provision, but there is actually no specialty. So you can be family physician, you can be an emergency doctor, you can be a neurologist, you can be an anesthesiologist. So they represent the wide spectrum of our healthcare system. No one has to be a MAiD provider or assessor. So you might find your doctor is not interested or does not do that work for a variety of reasons. And so then you would call a standing, Ontario has a line through the provincial government where you would get connected with assessors and MAiD providers in your community.
So it's just that the doctor says, yes, I will be an assessor, there's no special test?
There's no special test, there's no training, anything like that. And then they have to keep the notes, and there's things they have to do to meet the law, or else they're offside of the law. So there was a question over here.
Hi, I'm not sure if you can answer this or not. If there's a change in the federal government, which there probably will be, can this whole MAiD legislation be rolled back by an incoming new government, or is it here to stay?
So it's by court order, and the court has mandated that the government address this. So that I imagine they could change legislation, but they would have to be in line with the findings of the federal court, right? So they don't necessarily have to expand. I mean, mental health is supposed to be part of it. They keep postponing it. Someone might eventually bring it, but the decisions about MAiD end up in court, because at this point, that's the system that has been deciding it.
I guess it's more of an observation than a question, but it seems to me, if I understand what you said about the general population's attitude, and as I think about it, it seems to me an awful lot of people who would like MAiD are not eligible under current legislation. So to me, it sounds like we have a bit of a mismatch. I'm thinking of situations that myself and my family and the population in general who would want to be for the advance permission, for example. Just one part. Seems to be the legislation is not in line, but I thought I heard you say the general population, which sounds more like my thinking as well.
Yeah, and I think that is the conversations that need to keep happening, because in terms of MAiD providers, I would have thought, but some of the MAiD providers are also not comfortable with advance requests, because we're assuming that the doctor who provides your MAiD is someone you've had a long-term relationship with, but that's not always the case. And so MAiD providers say, you write an advance request, you have Alzheimer's, you've set this criteria, but I come to you and you're quite happy in your place, and I don't know the you before, and then how do I do that? Because no MAiD provider takes this work lightly. They are causing death, right? And so MAiD providers themselves have concern about this. The other thing that's important to know is that just because you're approved for MAiD, a MAiD provider does not have to do it. So you can be approved, but for a variety of reasons, a MAiD provider could choose not to do that. So maybe you have intense discord in your family, and the MAiD provider is aware of that. Some MAiD providers would choose not to do that. Some MAiD providers will assess but won't do the provision. So again, just because we have the legislative right, you don't actually necessarily will get MAiD.
I had also been told that you have to re-qualify every 6 months. Is that correct?
I don't know that. That would be between you and your MAiD provider. I think that depends on the MAiD provider as well.
You don't need to requalify, but if the most MAiD providers continue to ask for appointment follow-up so that it's an ongoing conversation. Somebody could be on a MAiD roster living with stage 3 or 4 cancer for 2 or 3 years and still have a quality of life that they are not ready to choose MAiD.
Right.
So there is an opportunity for long-term follow-up where if your status is changing, you can review it with your MAiD provider. They'll keep you on their caseload even if you're months and months away from readiness to choose a provision.
Tekla, what surprised you in your journey in working in this area? What's been your best learning?
I think some of the things that I alluded to, I mean, one, just to bear with, like I have seen such intimate moments between loved ones, and I liked when we did this graphic memoir where you don't actually have the words to describe what you were seeing and witnessing, like just being able to be there and bear witness, coming to that realization about space, how you hold people and what that looks like and why that's needed. Some things that have kind of brought me to my knees is we do follow-up support with a primary support person. So 3 weeks after a MAiD provision, I'm calling the person who is closest or was my primary contact. And you think about like birthdays or Christmas kind of knock you to your knees, and you realize it's those small everyday life things that someone, shared with me. It was winter and they said, oh yeah, I just went out to shovel the snow. And usually when I came back in, someone would pat me on the head and say, oh, you did the snow, and it was done every time. And like, it's just like, that's nothing you TikTok or you put on Facebook. It's just those small personal moments that just mean so much to people, that people I bear witness that have been in relationships for 50 and 60 years and that person is gone, and what that means for them. And so I think a lot about isolation and how we support people after. And again, that determination of people really wanting it their way and going and that kind of thing. And that last kind of surprise is every time I think I know what I'm doing or what's going to happen, something different happens. So people are so unique about what they want and what happens when you gather. And you think, because I've done lots of different work, that there will be some sort of pattern, and there's just not in terms of how people approach their life and their death. So I have definitely seen things that I will carry with them and have made. And I guess the other thing as well, the work is really, really important. We also, through our research and also have had experience, we're just a small moment in time for these people, that there's so much has happened before and so much will happen after. So that was a lot. I've learned a lot. And I could probably go on more and more, but it's not small work, and it's not small decisions that people are making, both those who are making it and those who choose to support, particularly those who don't support the decision but are there for their person because they support the right that the person is making the decision, and they wish to high heaven that they didn't make that choice. I can't think of a greater gift.
This is terribly emotional work. How do you process all of that yourself? You go home at night. How do you deal with all of that?
So I'm a pretty cerebral person, so that helps. But I eat chocolate, I hang out with my friends, I talk, and it's an honor, right? Like you see, and I see some things that make me go, oh, and then you try and improve the system and things like that. Like I said, forced transfers are not my favorite. Well, I do appreciate the time that you've taken to learn about us. I could tell you a lot more about grief or the people who support, and more about how people get to us, and imagining that their planning their day of death and then find out their landlord won't let them have it in the house, or what that looks like and how they get to us at the last minute. But I really appreciate your attention, and I do really encourage you to keep on those conversations and reflecting yourself, and not to shy away from death, dying, end of life, for yourself and for those in your community, because the more we talk about it, the more that we can actually be there for people to have an enhanced end-of-life experience, whether it's MAiD or any other way. Thanks.
Thank you for watching. If you appreciate this content, please share it with your friends. Consider giving us a like, subscribing, and hitting the notification icon, as it really helps our channel. And as always, be good to you.